So, I've learned that there's nothing more deeply needed in the believer's life than a contemplation on a constant basis about forgiveness. And in fact, issues of forgiveness are often what hinder us from moving forward. There's no greater challenge for our life in Yeshua than learning to extend forgiveness to those who have hurt us deeply. I'm not talking about forgiveness as something that is simply superficial. I'm talking about those who have truly wounded us and for whom we feel deep and perhaps sometimes abiding animosity, deep anger. How do we deal with those issues? And I've learned how difficult this is in many ways. And in particular, let me tell you about an experience that I had. A very moving sermon was once given on forgiveness at the congregation that I was attending. And I went afterwards to speak to one of the pastors, a friend of mine. And we went to his office and we sat there. It was a long session. But he kept insisting that I had to forgive first. He said, Ben, the first thing you have to do is forgive. And I felt that the last thing I wanted to do was to forgive. This session went on. I would not begin with that step, and in the end, nothing happened. Nothing really took place. There was no progress, no sense of resolution, and I felt that this had been a waste of time. Because I felt that forgiveness was the last step and not the first step I could take. So where were we if that was the problem? What was I going to do? And what does a person do? Honestly, when you're listening to a message like this, it seems like the speaker is trying to get you to forgive. I mean, if you have feelings that we're talking about, it seems that the purpose of the speaker is to get you to forgive. The first thing I want you to know is this: I am not here to get you to forgive anyone. That's not my purpose at all. I think that's up to you. But I want to talk about this issue because it remains so significant for us, and it encompasses actually every relationship, as you well know. Every relationship. You know, parents and children, husbands and wives, colleagues at work, people who are in your past, long gone, but not forgotten, right? Forgiveness actually encapsulates the totality of our relationships. But what do we do when we're stuck, like I was in that office, and feel stuck? Feel it. And here we are talking about our faith, talking about praising God, moving on with God, celebrating God, but deep in our hearts there is a place where we feel we can't move forward. So how do we deal with that? And I want to talk about doing so because I'm more and more convinced that real forgiveness is not just an act of the will, it is an act of grace by the Holy Spirit. So I'm going to say some things that are very controversial here and some things that are difficult. And I'm going to do that from a perspective as a Jewish believer. There are so many areas that we could talk about, and like Michael Rydelnik, our speaker this weekend, I too come from a family that was permeated by the presence of the Holocaust. My father was also a survivor of a camp, and my mother's family escaped to Germany. They were part of that unique group that escaped from Germany early in the 1930s, went to Israel. She was raised there. All the family that she well remembered in Germany was wiped out. And just the presence, the horror of that just was left with her every day. Every day, my mother remembered the pain of the Holocaust, quite verbally. So here's the story I want to begin with. It's a famous story about forgiveness and really about unforgiveness too. And it's a story that has entered into Jewish culture a specific way. It's the story told by a famous Holocaust survivor called Simon Wiesenthal, and it's originally told in this book called The Sunflower. In that book, an event happens, and the event has entered Jewish lore and is told in a number of different ways. I'm going to tell it a little bit more accurately today. It's about Wiesenthal when he is a prisoner in a camp, one of the concentration camps in Poland. He was Polish. He was a Pole who had been submitted to this, a young man, barely out of high school. And he was assigned at one point to work in what was then a hospital. It had formerly been his own high school. It had been transformed into a makeshift hospital. A nurse approaches him and asks him, first of all, if he's a Jew. And he is wearing the concentration camp clothing, and he's not sure why she's asking him this, but he's had some experiences where on occasion very kind people identifying Jews will sometimes provide food for them, surreptitiously. But this nurse doesn't do that. She is one of those nurses who is tremendously efficient. She says, good. And she takes him with her. She walks through the hospital very boldly. And of course, this is all taking place while all these German officers are, and many of the patients in the hospital are German soldiers. She takes him up through this building, which he's very familiar with, and past the offices of former teachers at this high school who would have been called professors, and to the very room that every student would have feared most to some degree. It was the office of what we would have called the principal, but they called the dean. And in this office, everything that Wiesenthal was quite familiar with from knowing the office of the principal, the dean, was gone. He was looking at it was not simply another hospital room. It's a death chamber. And in it is a single bed and a man who is bandaged beyond recognition. The nurse guides him in. She sends him into the room, and she says, I'll be waiting out here. She makes it very clear he's to go inside. He goes inside, and what he encounters is an SS officer who is barely able to function, clearly is dying, and he is tormented. Although his eyes are bandaged over, and he can't really function at all except to do two things. One is to give himself a drink of water, which he can find almost by instinct with one arm. with one hand, and the other is the grip that he now holds on this man that he's speaking to. He doesn't ask for pity. He does not think of himself as extraordinary. He says, I know all around me people are dying. Thousands are dying everywhere. There's nothing special about me. And of course, Wiesenthal is himself, as a prisoner in a concentration camp, really doomed to death. There really is no future for these prisoners except death. And the young man begins actually by saying, well, I'm 21, and that is young to die. But that means nothing to Wiesenthal. And of course, as the man begins to talk, he relates what is a youthful life, and of course, what does Wiesenthal feel? He too had a similar life that was just a brief moment in passing, and now he's a prisoner doomed to death. But eventually, what comes out clearly is that this SS officer has such a tormented vision of what has happened to him that he cannot die in peace. He says, I must come clean. He had been religious as a youth, then he had gone into the Hitler Youth. He had become absorbed with the evil of that culture. He had pursued it to its end, even though his own family had respect for Jewish people, even though his father did not accept the Nazi ideology. This man had rejected all that, and at a certain point after his training and after being put into the army and then rushed to the front and numerous other circumstances, a terrible incident which to Wiesenthal was all too common. One incident had so tormented this man, he could not die in peace. The image before him was because in this terrible incident, they had shoved an entire community into a building which was set ablaze. And he remembered in one final act a family desperate to escape, and he had fired at them even as they were coming out of this building. Two parents holding a young child, a family similar to his own. He had lived in torment with this, and finally at this point, he didn't even know if there were any Jews left because of what was taking place around him. And so he had urged this nurse, after contemplating these things for some time. He had been in a battle, a bomb had gone off, most of his life had been destroyed in a moment, but he had lingered. He could not die. And finally, he convinced this nurse that he needed to speak to a Jew to ask for forgiveness. That's all he asked for. And the nurse, compelled to do a dying man's last will, had found Wiesenthal. Now, the story goes in popular culture, as I've heard it, Wiesenthal listens to him, and then, having heard his plea for forgiveness, gets up from the chair and leaves the room. That is how the story is remembered, and more than one Jewish person has said to me, this is a model response to our enemies. Those who have tried to destroy us and seek evil against us, we have nothing to forgive. And we need not extend forgiveness to them. This is, for me, a very important, very, very important touchstone of my culture. And of course, as a follower of Yeshua, it stands in incredible contrast to what Yeshua says. Now, as a Jew, of course, I have gone to synagogue at numerous times and prayed at Yom Kippur for forgiveness. By the way, we are going to do that again in this coming week. That is part of what we'll do as part of the 10 days of awe. We will take up this task, which we are called to do according to Scriptures, which is to afflict our souls, and we will do this by fasting. Many of my congregation will fast. I will be fasting. And we must do this in accordance with Scripture. Normally, when a Jewish person does this, they leave the synagogue and we say to each other, "May your name be inscribed in the book of life," but we don't know. We don't know. We say that on Rosh Hashanah, it is, the books are opened, and on Yom Kippur, it is sealed, but we don't know. We don't know. This is in contrast, of course, with followers of Yeshua, who receive, as part of really the regular service, the message, in Yeshua you are forgiven, right? That is actually, as someone who is trained in ministry, that is something I'm taught to do, to extend by authority the forgiveness of sins in the name of Yeshua, Jesus, our Messiah. One of the curiosities that I find, I hear this all the time, is Christians often say to me, "Why can't Jewish people forgive this way?" And the funny part about it to me is, Christians often wonder why Jewish people don't act like Christians. It's because they're not Christians. Why don't Jewish people act like Christians? They're not Christians, okay? That is not forgiveness as they understand it. Forgiveness for them is something for which they, deeply yearn, but for which they are understanding that they must also be worthy. They must be of forgiveness. That they can't just, you've asked for forgiveness and it's freely given. No. That is another culture. That's not our culture. And in fact, that's part of the larger picture here. But Yeshua is Jewish. And the wonderful thing about our Jewish Messiah is that he has taught us a different way of understanding forgiveness. So listen to what he says. In the Lord's Prayer, Matthew chapter 6, one of the very primary prayers of the believer's life, what do we pray? Forgive us our sins, or forgive us our debts. Actually, the Hebrew word hov actually means both things, and it's translated both ways. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. I could never figure out why 10-year-old children in my school were forgiving people who owed debts to them when clearly none of us had a mortgage. But nevertheless, the idea of forgiveness was pretty common in the prayer of Yeshua. What he says is, forgive as you are forgiven. Again, Mark 11:25, when you stand praying, if you hold anything against anyone, forgive him, so that your Father in heaven may forgive you your sins. But the The story which gives us the greatest clarity on Yeshua's teachings on forgiveness are here in Matthew 18, verses 21 to 35. Now, the context of this, the Jewish context of this, is quite simple. The rabbis taught that if someone sought your forgiveness over an issue, you were free to give it for 3 times. But if a person kept sinning past 3 times, no more forgiveness was necessary, or you're not required to do, because after all, obviously the person hasn't learned, right? So the answer of Yeshua in this case is quite fascinating, because Kepha, that is Peter here, comes to Yeshua and he says, "Rabbi, how often can my brother sin against me and I have to forgive him? As many as 7 times. So here is Kepha saying, hey, look, you know, what if I'm willing to forgive somebody even 7 times? Isn't that pretty good? Then Yeshua says to him, no, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Because of this, the kingdom of heaven may be compared with a king who decided to settle accounts with his deputies. Right away, they brought forward a man who owed him, and in our complete Jewish Bible, it says many millions. But, your translation will probably say something like 130 talents. That's 10,000 talents, sorry. He owes him a debt of 10,000 talents. Now, 10,000 talents is it's a hard figure to make specific. A talent was roughly 130 pounds. And the reason it's roughly that amount is because the talent was roughly the weight of an amphora. And some of you can still see amphoras today. They're a great big huge clay bottle filled with olive oil. And this was a common way of accumulating wealth in that time. And a talent then, roughly 130 pounds for this large clay bottle of olive oil, often was kept in some other currency, gold or silver. The problem is, at 10,000 talents, if that was gold, it would be hundreds of millions of dollars. If it was silver, it'd be $400 million. So there's really an exaggeration here of the debt. That's the point that Yeshua is trying to make. It's an unimaginable amount of money owing that could simply be repaid. So he is now, since he couldn't pay, his master ordered that he, his wife, his children, and all his possessions be sold to pay the debt. And this was quite common. A debt could be answered or dealt with by selling a person into slavery. But the servant fell face down before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. So out of pity for him, the master let him go and forgave the debt. But as the servant was leaving, he came upon one of his fellow servants who owed him some tiny sum. And he grabbed him and began to choke him, crying, "Pay back what you owe me." By the way, the tiny sum, or the comparatively tiny sum, is often given again in your translation. This is 100 talents, something which would be the equivalent, 100 denarii. That would be the equivalent, again, of about 100 days' wages. So it's a reasonable sum that could be paid back, in other words. The master, in this case, of course, or the servant, grabs that person and began to choke him, crying, Pay back what you owe me. And his fellow servant fell before him and begged, be patient, I will pay you back. But he refused. Instead, he had him thrown into jail until he should repay the debt. And when the other servants saw what had happened, they were extremely distressed. They went and told their master everything that had taken place. Then the master summoned his servant and said, you wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me to do it. Shouldn't you have pity on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? And in anger, his master turned him over to the jailers for punishment until he paid back everything he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat you unless you each forgive your brother from your hearts. Now, clearly, this is a powerful judgment on people like me, because I find it still hard to forgive. I've heard the story. I'm sure you've read the story more than once. Is there stuff in my heart which I'm still dealing with forgiving? Yes. Clearly, there is. I'm working at it, but there's stuff there. So how do we deal with that? I don't want to deal with it in a superficial manner. I want to take that seriously. Clearly, there are also consequences for unforgiveness. What will I do? How do I handle these things? It's often, as I said, a really precious relationship where this kind of unforgiveness breaks us. And of course, these things happen all the time. How long do marriages last in our society? How often do brothers and sisters break relationship over some argument? Frequently, how often do estate issues, after the parents are gone and the estate is left to be dealt with, how often does that lead to permanent divisions in families? Even the closest of friends will suddenly disagree, never speak to each other for years. All that time later, they will sometimes get back. Perhaps they'll meet at a funeral or some other event, and suddenly they'll begin talking and realize that whatever they were disagreeing about was so minor. They can't understand why they gave up what was precious to them for something so unimportant. This is how difficult and how challenging this problem is. Oh, by the way, recently the Sunday New York Times wrote a couple of articles on wedding gifts, which was quite fascinating because what came out very clearly was that decades after weddings, women who had not received a gift could name the person who had been at fault and had not forgiven. Decades later, they remembered people who had not brought a gift to the wedding, and they were not forgiven. One maid of honor in particular had promised a hooked rug for over the fireplace. It never arrived. However, this oversight finally had been partially forgiven because the bridesmaid is now married to the bride's ex-husband. Nevertheless, unforgiveness plagues us. And by the way, it happens in churches too. Yeah, we are not apart from having this kind of unforgiveness in our churches, and there's no doubt why, because of the way we treat each other. I still can't help seeing read about the story of the deacon who decided that his pastor should not get paid that week because he had been doing an evangelistic meeting elsewhere. And when the pastor came to him and said, "Where's my paycheck?" he said, well, wherever you preached last week, they should pay you. That, by the way, was the beginning of the end of that man's ministry in that church, but, you know, you can understand why people do get upset. I could never understand, perhaps, how one of the leaders of the small congregation I was a part of many years ago was told by one of the people to whom forgiveness was extended, came back with the answer, "Okay, I will forgive, but I won't forget." I thought to myself, how does this make us any different from unbelievers? In fact, it's pretty inefficient. They're much smarter. They know, don't get mad, get even. I mean, that's a better way of doing it. I wasn't raised in a family where we were overly apologetic, but of course I'm Canadian, so every other word is sorry. And I sometimes think, you know, maybe this story of the sunflower somehow was imprinted on me as the son of a Holocaust survivor. But here's the interesting aspect of it. Wiesenthal actually doesn't just walk out of the room. That's the fascinating thing about this story. And you should get this book so that you can examine what really happened. Because he does not just leave the room. He goes and he talks with his friends about what happened. And by the way, he does not want to end up back at this hospital. Nevertheless, the next day, despite all his attempts to get on some other work party, he ends up right back there. And by the way, the nurse finds him. She corners him and she says, "I have something for you. The young man died during the night and he asked me to give you his last possessions." Wiesenthal refuses, despite the fact that there might have been something in there that he might have used. He absolutely refuses, and to some degree, he flees. Still, for months afterwards, and he finds another prisoner who had gone to seminary. And the two of them talk about this story. At different times, Wiesenthal is again struck by the nature of this circumstance. After the war, despite how hard it is to travel, he remembers the address of the soldier's mother. He goes to the mother after the war. Now, he does not tell her he had actually met her son. He says, a note was passed to me. It's almost as if he's trying to figure out whether or not the story that the young man had told him was true. And every word that he's heard from the young man before he died was verified by the mother. He had grown up in the church. He had been, actually a good child. And then after he had joined the Hitler Youth, he had turned against his parents to some degree, their values. And then he had gone off to this war, very much severing a relationship with his father. And then finally, she had not understood at all what had happened. And she had that pack in her home of the last items, which Wiesenthal had refused and recognized. He did not tell her a word of what her son had done. Not a word. He leaves her with the remembrance of a good boy. And Wiesenthal himself, as he finishes this part of the book, says he was still struggling with that question. Could he forgive? Should he forgive? How to deal with forgiveness. And he then passes this story on to others, and the rest of the book is filled with some of the most compelling reflections from some of the leading thinkers of our time, including theologians, including one of the survivors of the killing fields in Cambodia, writers, and even Albert Speer, who had been convicted and went to Spandau prison. And all of these also reflect on the very same story. Clearly, Wiesenthal had deep ambivalence. One teacher, Eva Fleischner, posed the question again to her students again. The Christians forgave. They were ready to forgive this young SS officer who had gone off and done this terrible thing. You know, he had been essentially led down this wrong path. The Jewish students, of course, could not forgive him, would not forgive him. Dennis Prager again mentions this issue of the lack of assurance that Jewish people have after Yom Kippur. We pound our breast and openly confess the most thorough possible list of our sins. And I assure you, the list of sins that Jewish people give is extremely thorough. But afterwards, we have no assurance of reconciliation with God apart from trust that we have done everything possible. And among the community of believers, really, this story stands in contrast with another one that, again, I've heard amongst many believers. It's the story of Corrie ten Boom. She's released from the prison of Ravensbrück. Many of you know her sister, Betsy, died there in horrible circumstances, but Corrie, really by miraculous means, is spared. As she tells the story, every other woman of her age in that camp died after she left. It turns out it was a clerical error. And having been spared, she is now going to Germany after the war, and she is speaking to crowds of Germans about God's love and forgiveness. So here's the story, again, a little bit more accurately than it's popularly told. Corrie was in Munich in 1947, and a man approached her who she immediately recognized as a guard at Ravensbrück. And we should understand, a guard was not someone who was passive. He was someone who had submitted the prisoners to terrible treatment. He was an instrument of the hate and evil of the Nazi Empire that had tried in every way to impose the greatest sufferings on Jewish people before they were murdered. What often happened, as she said, was the country was so bleak and spiritually desolate that the crowds often had blank, questioning faces. They would listen to her speak, they would get up and leave. But this man, and she was shocked when he approached her, came up to her with almost familiar enthusiasm, eager to shake her hand. And she, almost as an act of defense, pulls up her pocketbook and reaches inside so that she doesn't have to do that. She describes what happened next. I, who had spoken so glibly of forgiveness, fumbled in my pocketbook rather than take that hand. He would not remember me, of course. How could he remember one prisoner among those thousands of women? But I remembered him, and the leather crop swinging from his belt. I was face to face with one of my captors, and my blood seemed to freeze. You mentioned Ravensbrück in your talk. He was saying I was a guard there. No, he did not remember me. But since that time, he went on, I've become a Christian. I know that God has forgiven me for the cruel things I did there, but I would like to hear it from your lips as well, Fräulein. And again the hand came out, will you forgive me? Now, this is not an unknown story to us. Let me continue. As I stood there, I whose sins had again and again to be forgiven, could not forgive. Betsy had died in that place. Could he erase her slow, terrible death simply for the asking? It could not have been many seconds that he stood there, hand held out. But to me, it seemed like hours. I wrestled with the most difficult thing I had ever had to do. Now listen carefully to why she describes why she acts as she does. It is not a glib act of forgiveness. It is not given easily. She has a reason. I knew it not only as a commandment of God, but as a daily experience. Since the end of the war, I had had a home in Holland for the victims of Nazi brutality. Those who were able to forgive their former enemies were able also to return to the outside world and rebuild their lives, no matter what the physical scars. Those who nursed their bitterness remained invalids. It was as simple and as horrible as that. And still, I stood there with the coldness clutching my heart. But forgiveness is not an emotion. I knew that too. Forgiveness is an act of the will, and the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. Help! I prayed silently. I can lift my hand. I can do that much. You supply the feeling. And so woodenly, mechanically, I thrust my hand into the one stretched out to me, and as I did, an incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder, raced down my arm, sprang into our joined hands, and then this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. I forgive you, my brother, I cried with all my heart. For a long moment, we grasped each other's hands, the former guard, the former prisoner. I had never known God's love so intensely as I did then. Note the name of the article, by the way, in which this is written. It was originally written for a Guideposts article called, I'm Still Learning to Forgive. But also her reasons. Those who were able to forgive were able to move on with their lives. And those who could not, stuck in bitterness, invalids still. Physically, perhaps, they were capable, but inwardly, invalids. So there is really in this story not simply a message of forgiveness, but also a larger issue of what does forgiveness mean for us in our ability to fully function, in our ability to fully be ourselves freely, and in a sense to be released into a full life. That is the issue. And in fact, that is the larger issue for Wiesenthal as well. How could he have the freedom of living while this issue still seemed to hang over his life? And that's the question. So how do we learn to forgive if we must forgive? So let's talk about it. First of all, saying I'm sorry and truly forgiving people who have deeply hurt you should not be like putting ketchup on a hot dog. It shouldn't be something that comes easily. All right? We should struggle with it. We should have a meaningful response to what is clearly something meaningfully imprinted on us. We should, in some way acknowledge that there has been pain, and that this pain means something to us. We should be able to acknowledge and put into perspective, what has this done to me? And be able to say for ourselves, I feel wounded. We should be able to acknowledge that. I don't think that there's anything wrong with saying, I feel wronged, I feel a certain way. We should be able to acknowledge fully that our feelings are not meant simply to be set aside and our feelings don't count. And that we should belittle our feelings is one of those wounding things that sometimes happens when our true hurts and pains are being shuffled off when somebody says, well, why can't you just forgive and move on, just like Jesus says? Because it's perfectly appropriate to acknowledge fully what has happened to you. There is nothing wrong with that. Also, one of the key reasons that I feel most people refuse to accept forgiveness is that sometimes we are afraid of being exposed for having been wrong ourselves in a situation, and sometimes we feel we will be diminished. You know, real men never say they're sorry. You know, real men never apologize for what they've done. I seem to know a lot of real women too. And of course we will point out, why should I apologize? I did nothing wrong, is an issue. And we need to sometimes recognize that that's a put on. That we are pretending to be confident on the outside, and in fact, the issue may well be self-esteem. We may not know how to deal with having to apologize as an act of self-esteem. And we may be feeling that it would belittle us. But, of course, the truth is, if you believe that Yeshua is Lord of your life and that He died for you on the cross, and you say, I've done nothing wrong, you obviously don't have a clue, because then you should have died for Jesus. The fact is, we are all sinners. That's the bottom line. As a believer in Yeshua, I can say I'm a sinner saved by grace. That is, for me, all that I truly know as truth about where I stand before God. I'm a sinner, somewhat saved by grace, by the skin of my teeth, as Peter says, quite accurately. And if I am seeking forgiveness, it's from another sinner. And if I have been hurtful, then I've been hurtful to another person, and I have no claim to be superior to them. Gary Chapman, who wrote that wonderful book, The 5 Languages of Love, that you're familiar with, has also written a book on apologies. He and a co-worker who specifically approached him in this area run apology and love seminars where they have couples turn to each other and they say these words, listen carefully, I know I'm not perfect. I hope you will forgive me for past failures. I sincerely want to be a better partner, and I'm asking you to teach me how to love you, to freely forgive and be forgiven. This is something our marriages need. You know, the thing that I weep for most marriages today is prayerlessness. We do not know how to pray for each other. And that is a fundamental weakness in our society, because at least when there's superficial religion, at least people know about prayer. Now, most couples are not even equipped superficially with the knowledge of prayerfulness for each other. But forgiveness begins with partners who are able to say, teach me how to love you, to freely forgive and be forgiven. Now, if you can't say that to somebody with whom you're in that kind of intimate relationship, I'm sorry for you. Some of the people against whom we are most angry because of their lack of forgiveness simply have a veneer of confidence. And my guess is that you prick that and you'll get into a real swirling, deep mess of issues. So I don't think any of us has it on top of the other. The most important thing is that Yeshua did not die for people who were cool or capable or successful. He died for sinners. He died for you. And I think that the hardest thing we have to do is lay at the foot of the cross all those fears of inadequacy and of the pain of loss that is now either anger or despair. And think again of those words of Corey. Those who were able to forgive were able to return and rebuild their lives. Those who nursed bitterness remained invalids. So the question largely is not, should I forgive? Must I forgive? The question for me is, how do I restore myself out of the brokenness, out of carrying anger that is the leftover detritus of unforgiveness? I'm going to tell you a story. I was doing a funeral of one of the most beloved colleagues amongst the Messianic Jewish believers here in Canada. Paul Fedor, long-time Jewish missionary in the city of Hamilton. I was doing his funeral, and in walked a dear friend, Reverend Bruce Woods. Bruce and Paul had been prayer partners for many years, and Bruce insisted on being able to take part in the funeral, and of course I agreed. He took part by doing a prayer, and then he took a few moments to tell words about his beloved prayer partner. And that included these words, which he shared with all of us. They were praying together, he said, and one day, Paul Fedor said in their prayer, "O Lord, thank you for your enemies. You know how much we need them." You know how much we need them. One of the things that we need to understand is that perhaps God is using these circumstances to shape us in ways that will be helpful to us, that perhaps will nurse in us or work in us some greater aspect that needs to change. Now, I think there's another thing that's extremely important, and that's why I'm going to go back to this book, and I'm taking some extra time. But I want you to hear some of these reactions, and I think this is really what's one of the most important aspects about unforgiveness. We sometimes don't want to forgive somebody because we're concerned they're going to get away with something. We feel like they did that, and if I forgive them, it will simply allow them to get away with something that they did wrong. And so we nurse that anger and hurt against them. And you know what? I think we just need to face it. Nobody's getting away with nothing, folks. Do you think somebody's going into their little room, closing the door, and they're not feeling the shame, pain, and the reality of the way that they've treated people? And it's not being reflected right back to them? I assure you, that is exactly what is happening. When people are alone with God, they are not looking at Him in the eye and saying, well, I got away with it this time. Nobody's doing that. Nobody. Listen to these words, and I want you to, for a moment, hear the words of the young SS officer and ask yourself what you would have done if you were in Wiesenthal's shoes. Remember, I told you the story of the family. They had plunged out of this building, and this man had fired at them. They were told to shoot at all those who were trying to escape. We were approaching Tagarog, which was strongly held by Russians. We lay among the hills, barely 100 yards. The artillery fire was incessant. We cowered in our trenches. We waited for the order to attack. It came at last. We climbed out of the trenches and charged. Suddenly I stopped as though rooted to the ground. Something seized me. In that moment, I saw the burning family, the father and the child. And they came to meet me. No, I cannot shoot at them a second time. The thought flashed through their mind. And then a shell exploded by my side. And I lost consciousness. That was the last thing the man saw with his own eyes. Nobody is getting away with anything. The question for us is not, am I going to forgive and that they get away with it? But am I going to get on with my life as a whole person in all that Yeshua has for me if I don't let go of that which holds me back? Nobody's getting away with anything. And by the way, the story is also told in here by Albert Speer about the humanity that he experienced when he met Wiesenthal face to face. And Speer says, your attitude towards me helped to restore me as a human being. As we close, I want to say this. I want to be able to say to people, I forgive you because of what the Lord has done for me. And maybe I can't say that. And the truth is, I really don't want to say that to people. Maybe I just want to be in my own heart capable of saying, Lord, I forgive them because of what you did for me. But at least that's a step in the right direction. And that is all we can do. We cannot settle old scores. We cannot right old wrongs. But we need to remember that the high priest used to have two epaulets on his shoulders. Inscribed on these epaulets were the names of the tribes of Israel. And do you remember that passage in Isaiah chapter 9 where it says concerning the Messiah, the government will be on his shoulders? We had got to put that back. That's what lordship means. You know, Lord, you know the situation. And I'm putting it back where it belongs. These shoulders are too weak. and this heart is too faulty. For all those reasons, that is why I need to begin the process of forgiveness. I want to be an instrument of grace by being honest, because I'm just another sinner. As a friend of mine used to say, beloved missionary now gone to be the Lord, I'm just another beggar telling a beggar where to find bread. That's why I want to speak about forgiveness. I tell you, I believe that the most powerful instrument in this world against evil is the message that you can be forgiven, and that the greatest evil being done is being done against people to prevent them from receiving the freedom of forgiveness so that they can go on and live independently and without the horrific pressure of doing those things which are inhuman and they don't want to do, because there is a freedom when people feel and find forgiveness and release it. And release it to others. I believe that what Wiesenthal was doing as he quarreled with himself over this issue was he was trying to release it for the sake of finding his own humanity. And this is the greatest reason for giving forgiveness, is so that we too can truly be free. Actually, Yeshua doesn't say these things because he wants to put anything on us. He's not trying to belabor us with the demand for forgiveness. He wants us to be free. And the only question is, will we be free? Will we allow ourselves to be free? As we close today, I really don't have anything to tell you or to instruct you. You know, I often go on long trips for this mission. Often, as I travel by night along long roads, you may wonder what I think about. Often, I allow memories to surface. Those are often times when I remember hurts, pains, struggles. To me, it often feels like a cabinet is opening and almost the old wounds come out. And in each case, I want to say, Lord, I want to apply the blood of Yeshua there. I want to apply the blood of Yeshua there. In each case, I want to apply the blood of Yeshua so that I can be free. That is the only reason for seeking such forgiveness. And the only reason for asking for it. And so if you are like me, having been in that situation where you feel stuck, take a moment. Not to rush to do something you don't want to do, but to begin. You're not stuck. There is not an act of will that anyone can demand of you. But there is a grace waiting for you if you are open to it. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, for those people here who are today stuck as I have felt, and sometimes still feel, against those who have wounded me deeply, I pray that we may begin. Maybe a person has tried to forgive, but they weren't ready. So we pray, Father, that they will be able to begin that process. Perhaps someone here has struggled with unforgiveness and sees a way forward. I pray, Lord, that you would open up that way so that they would understand how God sees them and the person whom they have not forgiven, that God sees them both as sinners equally needing healing and grace. And if some of us are just so angry and hurt that we feel wounded. I pray, Heavenly Father, by your Spirit, you would help us to tend our wounds so that we will begin to be able to deal with these hurts and pains so that we should not be invalids, that we should find freedom, grace, and mercy, not for the sake of the wounds themselves or the hurts themselves, but that we should find a way forward to let grace freely come. As Jew and Gentile, the promise of Yeshua is waiting. The grace, that greater grace of his, that all which he provided on the cross, the cursed tree, and now freely flows for us when we are able to say, Lord, I give this to you. And in the name of Yeshua, I truly forgive, even as I've been forgiven. Amen.